Stand in the ruins of Persepolis today, and the first thing that hits you isn't the scale, it's the heat. 40 degrees Celsius in the Fars Highlands. The air tastes of dust and dry stone. The ground beneath your feet is pale limestone, bleached almost white by 25 centuries of Iranian sun. And rising out of it, impossible, defiant, 70 feet tall, are columns that have no business still being here. Alexander the Great burned this palace in 330 BCE. His soldiers drank through the night, loaded the treasury onto 5,000 camels, and then put torches to everything that remained. The fire was so vast it was visible for miles across the plain. And yet, the columns survived. They've stood here ever since, watching everything. Parthian kings, Sasanian warriors, Arab armies from the west, Mongol horsemen from the north. Every conqueror who came through this land looked up at these stones. And every one of them eventually disappeared. The columns are still here. They are this story's spine. We'll return to them. Because Persia, the civilization, the idea, the identity, did exactly what those columns did. It was burned, conquered, and overwritten more than once. And every time, it found its way back to something recognizably itself. Using advanced AI techniques, we've reconstructed the palaces, the royal roads, the fire temples, and the lost cities of one of history's most extraordinary civilizations. This is 3,000 years of Persia, the civilization that never disappeared. We'll watch a scattered tribe of horsemen build the largest empire the world had ever seen. We'll see how one man's torch undid 2 centuries of Persian genius, and why it ultimately didn't matter. We'll witness Persia absorb Alexander, outlast Rome, and survive the Mongols. And we'll follow the unbroken thread that connects ancient Pasargadae to modern Tehran. Let's begin at the beginning. Around 1000 BCE, a group of Indo-Iranian tribes drifted south from the Central Asian steppes and settled on the high plateau between the Zagros Mountains and the Persian Gulf. They weren't powerful, they weren't famous. They paid tribute to the Medes, a neighboring people who actually ran things in this part of the world. But these settlers, the Parsa as they called themselves, carried something that would matter enormously later: a religion. A god of light named Ahura Mazda, a prophet named Zoroaster who taught that truth was sacred and that lies were a form of cosmic violence, an offense against the very structure of reality. No armies yet, no palaces, no empire, just a people with a fire they kept burning and a belief that the world had a moral architecture. That idea sounds abstract. In practice, it made them different rulers from almost everyone around them. Most ancient empires conquered through terror and extraction. Persia, when it finally arrived, would try something considerably stranger. But that was still centuries away. First, a man needed to be born who would change everything. His name was Cyrus. In 559 BCE, he became king of a small, unremarkable Persian tribe in the hills of what is now Iran's Fars province. Within 30 years, he would rule the world. Cyrus the Great is one of history's most genuinely strange conquerors. He beat the Medes in 550 BCE, the people who had dominated his tribe for generations. He turned west and crushed Lydia. He swept east through Central Asia. Then, in 539 BCE, he marched on Babylon, one of the most fortified cities on earth, and the gates opened without a fight. Here's what makes this remarkable. When Cyrus entered Babylon, he did something almost no ancient ruler ever did. He didn't burn it. He didn't enslave the population. He didn't tear down its temples. He issued a decree, inscribed on a clay cylinder that now sits in the British Museum, announcing that all peoples under his rule were free to practice their own religions, speak their own languages, and return to their own homelands. the Jews held in Babylonian captivity for 50 years? He let them go home to Jerusalem. He rebuilt temples to gods he didn't worship. He governed through local administrators who understood local culture rather than imposing Persian overseers who didn't. Ancient Greek historians, often openly hostile to Persia, still called him the father of his people. The prophet Isaiah, writing from the Jewish tradition, called him the anointed of God. Was Cyrus a genuine humanitarian, or a brilliant political operator who understood that tolerance was cheaper than suppression? Historians debate this. The answer is probably both. What's beyond debate is the result. Within 3 decades, one man from a minor hill tribe built the largest empire the world had yet seen, stretching from modern Turkey to the edges of India. And he built it largely without terror. His son Cambyses extended the empire into Egypt. Then, in 522 BCE, a general named Darius, through methods that were almost certainly not entirely legal, seized the throne. Darius didn't just rule the empire, he rebuilt it from the foundations up. Darius I inherited a vast, chaotic empire held together mostly by military force. What he built in its place was something the ancient world had never attempted: a functioning multi-ethnic civilization with standardized law, professional infrastructure, and a communications network that could carry a message from Sardis in western Turkey to Susa in Iran in 7 days. 7 days, more than 2,000 miles, the Royal Road. Darius built it, a 2,500-kilometer highway with rest stations, fresh horses, and royal couriers posted at regular intervals. It was the ancient world's closest equivalent to a postal system, and it worked. He standardized weights and measures across 30 different nations. He introduced a gold coinage, the daric, that circulated from Egypt to India. He constructed a canal connecting the Nile to the Red Sea, 3 centuries before Alexander ever imagined such a thing. And then he built Persepolis. Construction began around 518 BCE on a raised stone platform in the Fars Highlands. For decades, workers from every corner of the empire, Greeks, Babylonians, Egyptians, Lydians, carved, hauled, and assembled the most magnificent royal complex in the known world. The carvings on the great staircase walls show the subject nations arriving in procession. Babylonians carrying cloth, Armenians leading horses, Ethiopians bearing gold. A frozen parade of the ancient world cut into limestone and still perfectly legible today. At its peak, historians estimate the empire governed around 50 million people, a figure that represented perhaps 1/3 to half of the world's entire population at the time, though scholars debate the exact numbers. But it kept losing wars to Greece, Marathon in 490 BCE, Thermopylae and Salamis in 480. Every Greek child grows up knowing these names. From the Persian side, they were costly frontier embarrassments, not existential threats. The existential threat came later, and it came from a 22-year-old Macedonian king with something enormous to prove. In 334 BCE, Alexander of Macedon crossed the Hellespont with 40,000 soldiers and a mission to destroy the Persian Empire. Within 7 years, he had done it. He beat Persian armies at the Granicus, at Issus, at Gaugamela. Darius III fled east, was betrayed by his own generals, and died abandoned in a ditch in Bactria. The Achaemenid dynasty, the line of Cyrus, of Darius, of Xerxes, was over. Then Alexander came to Persepolis. Ancient sources describe what happened next with a detail that feels almost too cinematic to believe. A banquet, wine, a woman named Thais, who proposed that the palace deserved to burn as revenge for Persia's sacking of Athens 150 years earlier, and then torches moving through the dark. The great audience hall became a furnace. 2 centuries of Persian royal history turned to ash in a single night. The man who ordered it reportedly wept as he watched it fall. Whether that's genuine remorse, political theater, or legend polished smooth by retelling? We may never know. But here's what the fire didn't touch: the idea of Persia. Alexander didn't destroy it. He was absorbed by it. He adopted Persian dress, performed Persian court ceremonies, married a Bactrian princess, and commanded his generals to take Persian wives. He tried, imperfectly, controversially, to fuse the Greek and Persian worlds into something new. When he died in Babylon in 323 BCE at 32, his empire shattered within a generation. The Seleucid dynasty inherited Persia's heartland, and slowly from the eastern steppes, a new Iranian power assembled itself. The Parthians. Different people, different tribe. But they spoke an Iranian language. They honored Zoroaster's fire. They built on Persian administrative foundations. And for nearly 5 centuries, they held Rome to a standstill, something no Western power had ever managed. Crassus lost his legions at Carrhae in 53 BCE. His severed head was reportedly used as a prop in a Greek play performed at the Parthian court that same evening. Rome never conquered Parthia, and when the Parthians finally fell in 224 CE, not to Rome, but to an internal revolt, the dynasty that replaced them made their lineage explicit. They called themselves the heirs of Achaemenid Persia. They named their empire after their ancestral homeland. The Sasanians had arrived. The Sasanian Empire lasted 4 centuries, 224 to 651 CE, and in many ways, it was the fullest flowering of everything Persian civilization had been developing for 1,000 years. Their cities were vast, their bureaucracy sophisticated, their artists produced metalwork and woven silk that was copied from China to Constantinople. The architectural innovations they pioneered, the barrel vault, the Iwan Hall, elaborate stucco decoration, would go on to define Islamic architecture for the next millennium. The Silk Road ran through Sasanian territory, and wherever Persian merchants traveled, Persian culture traveled with them. At their height, the Sasanians fought on 2 fronts simultaneously: Rome to the west, nomadic confederacies to the east, and held both. In 260 CE, King Shapur I captured the Roman Emperor Valerian in open battle, captured him alive, the only Roman emperor ever taken prisoner. The carved reliefs at Nakshi Rostam, a few miles from Persepolis, show the moment still: Shapur on horseback, Valerian kneeling, Persian stone, outlasting Roman humiliation. But empires hollow themselves out. By the early 600s, decades of devastating war between the Sasanians and Byzantines had bled both sides to exhaustion. By the early 600s, decades of devastating war between the Sasanians and Byzantines had bled both sides to exhaustion. By the early 600s, decades of devastating war between the Sasanians and Byzantines had bled both sides to exhaustion. By the early 600s, decades of devastating war between the Sasanians and Byzantines had bled both sides to exhaustion. Treasuries empty, armies spent, populations fractured. Then, from the Arabian Peninsula, something no one anticipated: Islam. Arab armies moved with staggering speed. In 636 CE, at the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah, they shattered the Sasanian military. In 642, the last organized resistance collapsed at Nahavand. In 651, the last Sasanian king was murdered by a miller in the north of Iran. The empire was finished. But what followed was not erasure, it was transformation. Persian language survived the conquest entirely. Persian poetry didn't just survive, it flourished, becoming one of the glories of the Islamic world. Persian scholars, astronomers, physicians, and philosophers became the engine of the Islamic Golden Age, working from libraries in Baghdad, Nishapur, and Bukhara. When Ferdowsi completed the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, around the year 1000 CE, He did it in Persian, preserving the full memory of Cyrus and Darius and the Achaemenid world in verse so powerful that Iranians still recite it today. The Mongols came in the 13th century and killed on a scale that left whole provinces empty. They burned Nishapur. They destroyed the ancient irrigation networks that had fed the Iranian plateau for 1,000 years. Persia rebuilt. Timur came. The Safavids came. The Qajars came. Each wave reshaped the land, rewrote the political order, introduced new rulers and new crises. And after each wave, something unmistakably Persian emerged from what remained. The same language, the same poetry, the same memory of who they had been and what they had built. Go back to Persepolis now. Stand in that same bone-dry heat, on that same bleached limestone plateau. The columns are still there, the ones Alexander's fire couldn't bring down, the ones every subsequent conqueror walked past without toppling. They weren't preserved by luck. They weren't protected by any single king or dynasty or army. They're standing because the civilization that raised them had learned over 30 centuries that what matters most cannot be destroyed by fire, not the language, not the memory, not the columns,